Join me in prayer. God, we gather today to explore your word. Open our hearts and minds to hear you, and free our wills to follow you. Open my mouth to speak your words to your service and praise. Amen. So this is our last sermon in this series about the Bible. Not that we're going to stop looking at the Bible, but this is the last sermon of this series. We spent the summer looking at the various kinds of literature that we find in the Bible. It's been quite the rush because there's so much material to cover. And some of you will notice we haven't touched on Revelation. So for those of you who are holding your breaths for that, some are laughing. I'm going to, this winter actually, at some point in the end times, or rather in the hard question series, I'll talk about the end times, and we'll touch on Revelation there. But today we're looking at the letters of the New Testament. In my first pastoral calling, it's now almost 40 years ago, I led the youth Bible study, and one evening I opened it up to questions and comments. Just ask anything you want, I said. And a youth whose father and mother were deacons said that he didn't think that the letters in the New Testament were really letters. They're really sermons in disguise, he said. In answer, I opened up my Bible to our reading this morning from 2 Timothy, and I said, what does that sound like? And he said, a letter, but I could tell I hadn't convinced him. We have in the New Testament this series, or this collection of short books that purport to be letters. At least one of them, Hebrews, by the way, works really well as a sermon. When I took the general epistles back in college days, my teacher one day actually just preached it all the way through. The letters are by Paul and Peter, James, John, and Jude. So in the early 300s, the church was finalizing its list of materials that it was going to be included in the New Testament. And they had a few rules that they followed. First was that a book either had to be by an apostle or by somebody who was associated with an apostle. So Luke traveled with Paul, and so both his gospel and the book of Acts were included in the New Testament. Mark traveled with Peter, so his gospel was included. All of the John books, so there's the gospel, there's 3 letters, and the book of Revelation, were assumed to have been written by John the apostle, and so they were included. And the book of Hebrews was included because some thought that it was written by Paul, and it was included then. It stayed included even though very shortly after that, within a couple of decades, they decided, it's not really by Paul. But it was left in the Bible anyways. And the rest of the books came to the early church as written by an apostle, Matthew and John, for example, and so they were included. So that was the first rule. Is it connected to an apostle? The second rule was, is it used by lots of people over a wide span of the geography where the church had gone? Was it used by many people? If so, it would probably be included. Now, there were a few books that were used over a wide area. One of them was a book called The Shepherd of Hermas, but there was no apostle's name connected to it, so they weren't included. And the book of Revelation almost didn't make it because even though it had an apostolic name connected to it, it wasn't used by very many people. In fact, as some people thought, for sure it should not be included in the Bible. So then the letters were arranged with Paul's first, from the longest to the shortest, and then the other letters were included, again, from the longest to the shortest. And you can see in your Bible that Hebrews was put with the other letters. So that's just something about the arrangement of these. So the letters are teaching, advice, communication with individuals and groups, most in specific locations at one point in time. And it helps us to understand them and what's said in them if we know or we can figure out what was happening in the background. So the rest of the sermon is basically some examples of that. The book of Hebrews, if you read it, feels a bit strange to us. The writer pulls a lot of Old Testament scriptures, just kind of pulls out of context and applies them to the church and to Jesus. Jesus and the church in this come out far better than being Jewish. And though we don't know exactly who wrote it or exactly when, we can figure out pretty quickly that the letter, or was it a sermon, was written to Jewish Christians who were seriously considering leaving Jesus behind and returning to being just Jews. So this method of using the Bible, pulling a verse out of context and saying, well, this is what it actually means, was common to Jewish interpreters. We can actually find the Apostle Paul doing it pretty often as well. He was a trained Jewish rabbi. When we figure out to whom and why it was written, the many passages that talk about the time of the temple and of the Jewish law and being in the past make more sense to us. This is past, people. Now we're going forward with Jesus is the aim of the book, the letter. A second example. In the book of Galatians, Paul goes to great pains to describe how he received his call and message directly from God through Jesus, and not from the leaders in Jerusalem. In particular, not from James. James, the brother of Jesus, continued to obey the law all his life and seems to have wanted all Christian Jews to do the same. And since this call to obedience went out to Jews, it tempted non-Jewish Christians to do the same. In fact, there were Jewish Pharisaical Christians who went from place to place to try to convince non-Jewish Christians to become Jewish. But Paul, who disagreed with James on this, and who claimed to have his message directly from God through Jesus, told the story to the Galatians about how Peter, when he came to Antioch of Syria, ate and drank and lived as if he was a Gentile. And the good news of God having drawn near to all people was freedom from the law for all people, for Jews and non-Jews. So if we see the background of what's happening in the book of Galatians, we understand better what's going on in the book. Another place where this kind of tension between James and his followers, who wanted folk to show their faith in Jesus through actions on one hand, and Paul and his followers who wanted people to simply believe, have faith in God in order to come to Jesus, we find that as we compare the book of James with the book of Romans. In Romans, Paul goes to great effort to make the case that Christians are made right with God through faith alone. He goes through a long discussion in chapter 4 about Abraham. Was Abraham made right with God before or after he was circumcised? Before or after he was a Jew? Well, he was made right with God by faith alone because it came before he was circumcised. That's Paul's conclusion. That means anyone, everyone, Jew or non-Jew, could be right with God without obeying the law. But James in his letter says, "What good is it, my brothers and sisters, if you say have faith, but you have no works to prove it? Can faith save you? If a brother or a sister is naked or lacks daily food, and one of you says to them, 'Go in peace, be warm, and eat your fill,' and yet you do not supply their bodily needs, what's the good of that? So faith by itself, if it has no works, is dead. But some of you will say, 'You have faith and I have works. Show me your faith apart from your works, and I, by my works, will show you my faith.'" It goes on like that for a while, and eventually says, "For just as the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without works is also dead." Using exactly the same story that Paul had used, James makes the case that faith isn't just something in our hearts and minds. For James, obedience to God through action is also important. He actually uses exactly the same story about Abraham that Paul used. So what's going on here? Non-Jews and many Jews were greatly influenced by Greek philosophy. You've probably heard of Plato. How many of you ever read Plato? Okay, I haven't either. In Plato, Plato claimed that all that really matters is the spirit. The flesh, the body, is just an outer shell that really means nothing. So what you do in your body does not affect the spirit. Paul and James are speaking to this. Paul agrees with Plato largely, even though he does lay down ways of living that are more in line with the Stoic philosopher descendants of Plato against the Epicurean philosopher descendants of Plato. The Stoics believed the flesh is meaningless. Don't do anything to take care of the needs of the flesh. Just live a basic life. Don't worry about the body. The Epicureans said, well, if the body doesn't really matter, well then eat, drink, and be merry because it doesn't matter. Do whatever you want in the body. It doesn't affect the spirit. Paul sided with the Stoics, but James on the other side, as a good Jew, believed that it's not just about spirit. We need to live in the flesh, in the body, according to all that God's Spirit is calling on us to do. In fact, what we do in the flesh shows what the Spirit is. Now, this is all about being right with God. Both James and Paul expected that as God's Spirit was active in a believer, that groups and individuals would do good works that would show the fruit of the Spirit. But James was always suspect in Paul in regard to that first movement of the person in faith. Is it with doing things, or is it not? Is it just faith, or do you have to also do something in order to be right with God? So these passages were written for specific groups of people with real lives, real life situations, and sometimes real problems. An example, Paul wrote to the Corinthian Church about communion. It's a passage we often read at communion. And he was addressing a real problem in the church. Paul calls it the Lord's Supper. As in many places, the church in Corinth was small and probably, almost certainly, met in someone's house. And generally, if at all possible, they would meet in a wealthier person's house. Most of these homes had a large open court in the middle, with a pool, actually. It was the family's source of water. So they had room for more people. And since the Greeks and Romans did not follow the Jewish pattern of Sabbaths, the Christians needed to worship on a day when probably most of them had to work. In Corinth, as in most places, the church would gather for a meal, for communion, and worship in an evening of one of those days. And some folk who had to work, often from sunrise to sunset, would drop off the food that they were contributing to the communal meal in the morning on their way to work. But the more wealthy people could arrive early at the house. And some of them were helping themselves to the food and drink that was to be shared, becoming overfull and even drunk. And Paul berates these people. They're wealthy. They could afford to stay home until the appointed time and eat and drink there rather than eating all that the poor had to eat that day. So when we understand how the early church worshipped, it helps us to understand Paul's letter to the Corinthians. A fourth example, we already talked about philosophy and how it affected the church and Christians. Later in Paul's life, a movement called Gnosticism arose. It wasn't purely Christian. There were non-Christian Gnostics as well. It was part of a larger movement that was called mystery religions that were popular at that time. So Gnostic means someone who has knowledge, special knowledge, hidden knowledge, mystery knowledge. They were called mystery religions. Christianity was actually one of them. These religions each claimed to have special knowledge from God that was only available to members of the inner group. For Christians, this knowledge was taught to those who decided to follow Jesus, and included the meaning of baptism and of communion and the nature of God as Father and Son and Spirit. But some of these theologians, philosophers, developed other so-called knowledge that included how to become more and more like God, maybe even become part of God. Some of these teachers had genealogies and hierarchies that connected humans to angels and angels to God. When Paul wrote to Timothy, what we just read, about leading the churches in what is now Croatia, he cautioned Timothy to stay away from such teachings. He called them myths. This teaching taught that Jesus was just a human being and that all could become God just like he did if you took part in special, hidden, and mysterious knowledge of the Gnostics. Paul instead taught that simple belief in God and living love-filled lives is what Christians were called to do. Now, some of this sounds a little bit far out there. Probably won't remember the Gnostics, or maybe even the Epicureans. But the letters of the New Testament were written to particular people who lived in certain times and at a specific time, certain places. They were part of their culture. They owned slaves, and the church was taught how to treat their slaves well, and for how slaves to treat their masters well, meaning obey your masters. Soldiers were taught to not loot or use their power inappropriately. Women and children were told and taught to obey the pater familialis, the father and master of the house. In Greek and Roman law, These men basically owned their wives and their children and could do with them what they wanted. And all these teachings end up in the letters to the churches, teaching folk to be good citizens in their time and place. But interestingly, the letters also start inching away from that culture. In his letter to Philemon, Paul calls on this master and slave owner to change the way he treats his slave Onesimus, who's become a Christian. In 1 Corinthians, Paul taught that, unlike in Greek or Roman thought, women could learn, think, and they could prophesy, that is, get messages from God for the whole group, including for men. In Ephesians, women are told to be subject to their husbands, but only after both men and women are told to be subject to each other. The church, through the letters, was moving along the conversation that we found in that culture. The Bible is really a record of a conversation about God and the creation and humanity. It was written to people who lived in specific times, with cultures, with influences from the culture around them. People who had questions about how to live in that culture. There were people who followed God from Abraham on down, who listened to God in the same ways that we do, and who heard God the same way we do, quietly, mysteriously, gently. They wrote down what they thought was God was saying to them in their time and place and in relation to the culture where they lived. And as time went on, they built on what had come before. As the years stretched into centuries and into millennia, they learned that their spiritual ancestors had been on the right track, but that God was pulling and pushing and encouraging them to build on the past, not just to stay in the past. The Bible is a record of that conversation from Abraham and Sarah to the end of the New Testament, somewhat over 2,000 years. It records arguments, disagreements, learning, interpretation, reinterpretation. How often do you hear Jesus say, "You've heard it said to you, but I say to you"? When I look at the teaching in the New Testament, it's gently moving Christians forward in regard to women and slaves and violence and many other issues. And when I see that, I think we have a pattern of God leading us from the Old Testament through those years into the New Testament, and even within the New Testament years. And I think that then God points us beyond the New Testament to keep on learning, to keep on disagreeing, to keep on growing, to keep on listening for what God is calling us to do in our time, in our place, in the culture that we live in. So, I'm going to invite you into a few minutes of contemplation. So, clear your laps off. Maybe turn your hands open in your lap if that's a way you can be ready to receive something. And close your eyes if you feel comfortable. And take 5 normal breaths. In your imagination or your memory, go to a place that's peaceful and quiet for you. Invite God to join you there. Is there a question about the Bible or from something in the Bible that troubles you? In this silence, ask God about this thing that troubles you. And sit with God. Tell God that you're willing to wait for an answer, but that you would like to get an answer. God, give us patience with you, with ourselves, and with others in our understandings and misunderstandings, agreements and differences. Lead us to live in love with you, with ourselves and our neighbors, and with your creation, our home.